Clint Eastwood stopped mid-sentence, looked at Johnny Carson, and said something he never told anyone. The studio went completely silent. It was March 1974. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B in Burbank. Another Thursday night. Another celebrity interview. Clint Eastwood was there to promote his latest film, a Western, naturally, the genre that had made him a household name. The audience was excited. Clint Eastwood didn't do many talk shows. He was famously private, notoriously uncomfortable with the interview format, the kind of star who let his work speak for itself. Getting him on The Tonight Show was a coup for the producers. Johnny opened the segment with his usual charm. A joke about westerns. A quip about Clint squinting. The audience laughed. Clint smiled that tight smile he was known for, the one that suggested he was tolerating this circus but not particularly enjoying it. They talked about the movie. About filming in Arizona. About working with horses. Standard stuff. Safe territory. Exactly what the producers wanted. No controversy, no surprises, just a pleasant 7-minute segment to fill time before the commercial break. And then Johnny asked what seemed like a throwaway question. So Clint, when you were a kid, did you always know you wanted to be an actor? Or did you have some other dream? Clint paused. His smile faded slightly. He looked down at his hands, then back at Johnny, and something shifted in his expression, something vulnerable that no one watching had ever seen from the man with no name. Actually, Clint said slowly, his voice quieter than it had been moments before. I wanted to be a pilot. That night on The Tonight Show, Clint Eastwood shared something personal and Johnny Carson put down his microphone and just listened, live on air, no jokes, just two men and a truth. The band was playing softly in the background, their usual interview bed music. Johnny glanced toward Doc Severinsen and made a small cutting gesture with his hand. The music stopped. The studio went quiet. Ed McMahon, sitting at his desk to Johnny's right, leaned forward slightly, sensing something was happening. The audience, which had been buzzing with energy moments before, settled into stillness. Johnny set his blue cue cards down on the desk. He didn't look at them again for the rest of the interview. A pilot? Johnny said, his tone completely different now. No performance, no setup for a punchline, just genuine curiosity. Clint nodded. Yeah. When I was 17, I enlisted. This was 1947, right after the war ended. I thought I'd learn to fly, maybe make a career out of it. The military seemed like the only way a kid from Oakland with no money could get into a cockpit. Johnny leaned forward, elbows on his desk, completely focused. What happened? Clint took a breath. I was stationed at Fort Ord in California. They had me doing administrative work while I waited for flight school placement. And one weekend I got a 3-day pass. September 1950. I decided to visit a friend up in Seattle. The studio was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the overhead lights. I hitched a ride on a Navy torpedo bomber. AD-1 Skyraider. Beautiful plane. The pilot was heading north anyway, said he'd drop me off. It was supposed to be routine, a couple hours in the air, land in Seattle, I'd have my weekend. Clint stopped. His jaw tightened. Johnny didn't interrupt. The silence stretched, but it wasn't awkward. It was the silence of someone gathering courage. We were about 20 miles off the coast of Point Reyes. Clint continued, his voice even quieter now, when the engine started making sounds it shouldn't make. The pilot tried to correct. We were losing altitude fast. He told me to prepare for a water landing. The audience was frozen. No one moved. No one coughed. 300 people holding their breath. We hit the water hard. The plane started sinking immediately. I got out. I don't even remember how, just instinct and adrenaline. The pilot got out too. But we were in the Pacific Ocean in September. The water was maybe 55 degrees. No life raft. No rescue beacon. Just two guys floating in the ocean in flight suits that were pulling us down. Johnny's face had gone pale. How far from shore? Far enough that we couldn't see it. We started swimming. The pilot, his name was Lieutenant Anderson, I'll never forget it. He was older than me, maybe 30. He kept telling me to stay calm, to conserve energy, to just keep moving toward where we thought the coastline was. Carson stopped mid-interview. The entire studio froze. We were in the water for maybe 3 hours, Clint said. Felt like 3 days. I've never been that cold in my life. Your body starts shutting down. You can feel it happening. Your limbs get heavy. Your brain gets foggy. You start thinking maybe it would be easier to just stop swimming. He paused, looking directly at Johnny now. Lieutenant Anderson saved my life. When I started going under, when I was ready to give up, he grabbed me. He wouldn't let me stop. He kept saying, "You're 17 years old. You don't get to drown today." Over and over. "You don't get to drown today." Johnny's eyes were glistening. He didn't try to hide it. We finally made it to shore. Clint continued. Crawled onto the beach somewhere south of Point Reyes. We laid there for probably 20 minutes, too exhausted to move. And then Lieutenant Anderson looked at me and said, "You still want to be a pilot?" A small, sad smile crossed Clint's face. I told him no. I told him I never wanted to get in a plane again. And he laughed, this broken, exhausted laugh, and said, "Good. Because I think God just told both of us to find different careers." The studio remained silent. The kind of silence that happens when people are processing something profound. 2 weeks later, Clint said, I got discharged on a medical exemption. The near drowning, the hypothermia, it messed up my lungs for a while. I ended up back in Oakland with no plan, no money, and no idea what to do with my life. He looked down at his hands again. A friend suggested I try acting. There were classes at the community college. I thought it sounded ridiculous, me, an actor? But I didn't have anything else. So I went. And here I am. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Johnny Carson had interviewed thousands of people. He'd heard countless stories. But something about this moment, about Clint Eastwood, Hollywood's toughest screen presence, talking about nearly drowning at 17, cut through all the television artifice and landed somewhere real. Did you ever see Lieutenant Anderson again? Johnny asked quietly. Clint nodded slowly. Once. In 1968. I'd just finished filming Coogan's Bluff. I got a letter. He'd seen me in some westerns, recognized me from the crash. He was retired by then, living in San Diego with his wife. Clint reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, worn photograph and held it up so the camera could see it. 2 men in flight suits, young and grinning, standing in front of a torpedo bomber. He sent me this. Said he'd kept it all those years. That's us, the morning before the crash. Some other pilot took the picture. Lieutenant Anderson wrote on the back, "The day we didn't drown." Johnny stood up. Not the performative standing he did for comedy bits. Just standing because sitting felt wrong for this moment. He walked around his desk and stood beside Clint's chair. "May I?" Johnny asked, gesturing to the photograph. Clint handed it to him. Johnny studied it for a long moment. These 2 young men who had no idea that in a few hours they'd be fighting for their lives in the Pacific Ocean. When he looked up, there were tears on his face. "This is extraordinary," Johnny said. "Do you still have contact with him?" Clint's expression changed. The vulnerability that had been there moments before was replaced by something heavier. "He died last year," Clint said. "Heart attack. His wife sent me a letter. The funeral had already happened by the time I got it. I never got to tell him." He stopped, composing himself. "I never got to tell him that everything I've done, every film I've made, every success I've had, it only exists because he wouldn't let me give up that day." Backstage, Johnny made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. The control room was in chaos. Director Bobby Quinn was frantically gesturing at the commercial break clock. They were running long. The sponsors were going to be furious. But Johnny Carson wasn't looking at the control room. He was looking at Clint Eastwood, who had just shared something profoundly personal on live television. Johnny made a decision. He turned to camera one. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know we're supposed to go to a commercial break right now. The producers are probably having heart attacks. But I think what Clint just shared with us is more important than selling soap." He looked back at Clint. "You said you never got to tell Lieutenant Anderson what his actions meant to you. But you just did. You told millions of people. And somewhere, I believe he heard it." The audience erupted in applause. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the deep, emotional applause of people who had witnessed something genuine. Clint nodded, unable to speak. Johnny handed the photograph back carefully, like it was made of glass. "Thank you for sharing this. And thank you for not drowning that day. Because the world would have lost something special." When they finally went to commercial, 5 minutes late, to the fury of the network executives, Johnny kept his hand on Clint's shoulder. The cameras caught it before they cut away. Two men who had started the interview as host and guest and ended it as something closer to brothers. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. After the commercial break, Johnny did something unprecedented. Instead of moving on to the next segment, instead of introducing the musical guest, he turned to the audience. "I want to ask you all something," he said. "How many of you have someone in your life? Someone who saved you, who changed your path, who made you who you are, and you've never told them?" Hands went up across the studio. Dozens of them. Then more. Then almost everyone. "Clint just showed us something tonight," Johnny continued. "He showed us that it's never too late to acknowledge the people who shaped us. Even if they're gone. Even if we think we've missed our chance." He looked at Clint. "You gave Lieutenant Anderson something tonight. You gave him a legacy. Now everyone watching knows his name. Knows what he did. Knows that he didn't just save one 17-year-old kid in the Pacific Ocean. He saved all the movies you'd go on to make, all the stories you'd tell, all the people you'd inspire." The audience stood. All of them. The applause was thunderous. Clint Eastwood, the man who had built a career on stoic silence, broke down. Not dramatically. Not performatively. Just quietly. Human tears on the face of someone who had finally said something he'd been carrying for 24 years. Johnny sat back down at his desk. He picked up the photograph again, that image of two young men before their plane crashed. "We're going to do something different tonight," he said to the camera. "I'm going to have our graphics department make a copy of this photograph. And I'm going to keep it right here, in my desk, as a reminder. A reminder that every person you meet is carrying stories you know nothing about. A reminder that the person sitting across from you might have survived something impossible. A reminder to listen." He looked at the photograph one more time before handing it back to Clint. "And a reminder," Johnny finished quietly, "that we don't get to drown today." The studio was silent again. Then, slowly, the orchestra began to play soft, respectful, the kind of music you play when words aren't enough. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. That night changed The Tonight Show. It changed how Johnny approached interviews. From that moment on, he listened differently. He asked deeper questions. He gave his guests space to be human. The photograph Clint showed became famous. NBC received thousands of letters asking about Lieutenant Anderson. His widow was invited to appear on the show. She came, and Johnny gave her a standing ovation before she said a single word. Johnny kept his promise. He had the photograph copied and kept it in his desk drawer for the remaining 18 years of his hosting career. Every night before the show, he'd look at it, a reminder of two young men who refused to drown. When Johnny retired in 1992, he gave the framed copy to Clint with a note. "Thank you for teaching me that the best interviews happen when you stop performing and start listening." Clint keeps it in his office. Above it, a small plaque. "We don't get to drown today."